The Galactic Empire stretched across the stars like a vast, unyielding shadow, its dominion unchallenged for millennia. Its fleets of warships, sleek and menacing, had crushed civilizations that dared to resist, leaving behind only ash and silence. The Empire's greatest warriors, genetically enhanced and battle-hardened, were the stuff of nightmares, living weapons designed to instill fear and obedience. They were the Empire's ultimate symbol of power, and their presence on a battlefield often meant the end of any hope for those who opposed them. Yet, for all their might, the Empire had never encountered a species quite like humanity. On the fringes of the galaxy, Earth orbited its sun, a blue-green jewel teeming with life. To the Empire, it was nothing more than a backwater planet, its inhabitants primitive and disorganized. The Empire's High Council had debated whether Earth was even worth the effort of conquest, but the allure of adding another star to their map proved too tempting. And so, the order was given: Earth would be brought to heel like so many others before it. The Empire's declaration of war arrived on Earth in the form of a holographic message, delivered by a sleek, black drone that descended into the heart of the United Nations headquarters. The message was brief and chilling. "Surrender or be annihilated," it declared, the voice of the Empire's emissary cold and devoid of emotion. "Resistance is futile. Your fate is inevitable." The leaders of Earth convened in an emergency session, their faces grim as they debated their options. The Empire's technological superiority was undeniable. Their warships could reduce cities to rubble in moments, and their warriors were said to be unstoppable. Yet, surrender was unthinkable. Humanity had fought too hard, endured too much to simply bow to tyranny. But what could they do against such overwhelming force? It was during this desperate discussion that a proposal emerged, an idea so audacious that it seemed almost laughable. The Empire, for all its might, adhered to a strict code of honor in warfare. They valued strength and skill above all else, and they respected those who could prove themselves in combat. If Earth could not defeat the Empire in a full-scale war, perhaps they could challenge them to a duel. A single combatant from each side, fighting to decide the fate of their people. The proposal was met with skepticism at first. Who could possibly stand against one of the Empire's greatest warriors? Earth's militaries were formidable, but they were no match for the genetically enhanced supersoldiers the Empire deployed. Athletes, scientists, and soldiers were all considered, but none seemed capable of facing such a foe. The debate dragged on, the weight of despair growing heavier with each passing moment. And then, she stepped forward. Martha was not a soldier, nor an athlete, nor a scientist. She was a farmer, a woman who had spent her life working the land, her hands calloused from years of labor. She was not young, nor particularly strong by conventional standards. But there was a fire in her eyes, a quiet determination that set her apart. When she spoke, her voice was steady and firm. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll fight for Earth." The room fell silent. Some laughed. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But Martha stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "You don't understand," she continued. "I've spent my life fighting. Against drought, against storms, against everything this world has thrown at me. I know what it means to struggle, to endure. And I'll be damned if I let some overgrown tin soldier take that away from us." Her words struck a chord. There was something about her, something raw and unyielding that made people believe. Against all odds, the leaders of Earth agreed. Martha would be their champion. The Empire, of course, was amused. When they received Earth's counterproposal, they laughed. A farmer? With a shovel? It was absurd, almost insulting. But the Empire's code of honor demanded that they accept the challenge. They selected their greatest warrior, a towering figure known as Kale Thor, whose reputation was unmatched. He had never been defeated in combat, and he relished the opportunity to crush this so-called champion of Earth. The duel was set to take place on a neutral planet, a barren world with a massive arena constructed for such events. The galaxy watched with bated breath as the day of the duel arrived. Martha stood in the center of the arena, her shovel resting on her shoulder, her face calm but resolute. Across from her, Kale Thor loomed, his armor gleaming, his energy blade humming with deadly power. The contrast between the two could not have been more stark. The crowd, a sea of alien faces, murmured in anticipation. Some cheered for Thor, others for Martha, but most simply watched, curious to see how this would unfold. The Empire's emissary stepped forward, his voice booming across the arena. "Let the duel begin," he declared. "May the strongest prevail." Thor wasted no time. He lunged at Martha with blinding speed, his blade slicing through the air. But Martha was ready. She sidestepped the attack, her movements surprisingly agile, and brought her shovel down with a force that surprised even her. The clash of metal against metal echoed through the arena, and for the first time, Thor's confidence wavered. The duel was far from over, but one thing was clear. Martha was not the easy victory the Empire had expected. And as the crowd watched, a spark of hope began to grow. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Earth stood a chance after all. The arena was a cacophony of alien voices, a symphony of gasps, cheers, and murmurs that rose and fell like waves crashing against a shore. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, every heartbeat louder. Martha stood at the center of it all, her shovel resting lightly on her shoulder, her eyes locked on the towering figure of Thor. He was a mountain of muscle and metal, his armor gleaming under the harsh light of the alien sun, his energy blade casting an eerie glow that danced across the sand-covered floor. To the galaxy, he was a legend, a warrior who had never known defeat. To Martha, he was just another obstacle, one she intended to overcome. Thor moved first, his blade slicing through the air with a speed that defied his size. Martha barely had time to react, her shovel coming up just in time to deflect the blow. The impact sent a jolt through her arms, but she held her ground, her feet digging into the sand. She didn't waste a second. With a grunt, she swung the shovel in a wide arc, forcing Thor to step back. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and jeers, their voices blending into a chaotic roar. The warrior's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He had expected this to be easy, a quick victory to add to his long list of triumphs. But Martha was proving to be more than he had anticipated. She was fast, her movements unpredictable, and there was a fierceness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. He lunged again, this time with a series of rapid strikes, each one aimed to overwhelm her. But Martha was ready. She dodged and parried, her shovel moving with a precision that belied its humble appearance. The sound of metal clashing against metal filled the arena, a rhythmic beat that seemed to echo the pounding of her heart. As the duel wore on, Martha began to notice patterns in Thor's attacks. He was strong, yes, and fast, but he was also predictable. His movements were calculated, almost mechanical, as if he had been trained to fight in a specific way. Martha, on the other hand, had no such training. Her fighting style was born of necessity, shaped by years of hard labor and the need to survive. She used her environment to her advantage, kicking up sand to obscure his vision, using the shovel not just as a weapon but as a tool to trip him up, to throw him off balance. Thor growled in frustration, his attacks growing more aggressive. He swung his blade in a wide arc, aiming to cleave her in two. Martha ducked just in time, the blade whistling over her head. She retaliated with a swift strike to his side, the shovel connecting with a satisfying thud. The crowd gasped as Thor staggered, his armor dented but not broken. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Martha didn't let up. She pressed her advantage, her movements becoming more fluid, more confident. She remembered the storms that had ravaged her farm, the way she had stood her ground against the wind and rain, refusing to let it take what was hers. This was no different. Thor was just another storm, another force of nature trying to break her. And she would not be broken. The warrior roared, his frustration boiling over. He charged at her, his blade raised high, ready to deliver a crushing blow. Martha stood her ground, her grip tightening on the shovel. At the last moment, she sidestepped, using his momentum against him. She brought the shovel down with all her strength, the metal connecting with the back of his knee. Kale Thor let out a cry of pain as his leg buckled, sending him crashing to the ground. The arena fell silent, the crowd holding its breath as Martha stepped forward, her shovel raised. Kale Thor looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He tried to rise, but his injured leg gave out beneath him. Martha stood over him, her chest heaving, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. For a moment she hesitated. She could end it now, deliver the final blow and claim victory for Earth. But something stopped her. She lowered the shovel, her gaze steady. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice carrying across the silent arena. "You don't have to be their weapon." Kale Thor stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed as though he might respond, might say something that would change everything. But then his eyes hardened, and with a roar, he lunged at her, his blade flashing in the light. Martha reacted instinctively, her shovel swinging in a wide arc. The sound of metal meeting flesh echoed through the arena, followed by a deafening silence. Kale Thor fell to the ground, his blade slipping from his grasp. The crowd erupted in a frenzy, their voices a chaotic blend of shock and awe. Martha stood over him, her shovel still in hand, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. She looked down at the fallen warrior, a pang of sadness cutting through the adrenaline. She hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted to take a life, but she had done what she had to do, what she had been forced to do. The Empire's emissary stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "The duel is over," he declared, his voice trembling slightly. "Earth's champion has prevailed." The words hung in the air, a weighty declaration that seemed to shift the very fabric of the galaxy. Martha turned to face the crowd, her shovel resting on her shoulder once more. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply stood there, a quiet symbol of defiance, of resilience. As the crowd began to disperse, whispers of her victory spreading like wildfire, Martha felt a strange sense of calm. She had done what she had set out to do. She had protected her home, her family, her world. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would not take this defeat lightly. They would come back, stronger, angrier. And when they did, she would be ready. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of rest. She looked up at the alien sky, the stars twinkling like distant promises. Somewhere out there, her farm waited for her, the land she had fought so hard to protect. And she would return to it, shovel in hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But for the galaxy, her victory was a spark that would ignite a fire that would burn brighter than any star. And as Martha walked out of the arena, her head held high, she knew that the fight was far from over. The silence that followed Martha's victory was deafening, a vacuum that seemed to suck the air out of the arena. The crowd, a sea of alien faces, stared in stunned disbelief, their cheers and jeers replaced by a collective hush. Even the Empire's emissary, who had so confidently declared the terms of the duel, stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. Martha remained at the center of it all, her shovel resting on her shoulder, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. She didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. She simply stood there, a quiet force of nature, her presence alone enough to command the attention of the galaxy. The Empire's warriors, those who had accompanied Kale Thor, hesitated. Their orders had been clear: ensure Earth's submission. But now, with their champion lying motionless in the sand, their resolve wavered. They looked to their emissary for guidance, but he seemed just as lost. For the first time in living memory, the Empire's invincibility had been shattered, and the weight of that realization hung heavy in the air. Martha broke the silence. "It's over," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You've lost. Honor your agreement and leave Earth in peace." The emissary's face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You think one victory will stop the might of the Galactic Empire?" Martha met his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "I think," she said slowly, "that you've underestimated us. And I think that's a mistake you won't make again." The emissary opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He glanced at the fallen Thor, then at the warriors who stood uncertainly behind him. Finally, with a curt nod, he turned and strode out of the arena, his entourage following in his wake. The crowd parted to let them pass, their murmurs growing louder as the Empire's representatives disappeared from view. Martha watched them go, her grip on the shovel tightening. She knew this wasn't the end. The Empire wouldn't take this defeat lightly. They would regroup, they would retaliate. But for now, Earth was safe, and that was enough. As the reality of her victory sank in, the crowd erupted into cheers. Alien voices, once filled with skepticism and mockery, now chanted her name. Martha, the farmer with a shovel, had done the impossible. She had stood against the Empire's greatest warrior and emerged victorious. To the galaxy, she was a symbol of hope, a beacon of defiance in the face of tyranny. But to Martha, she was just a woman who had done what needed to be done. When she returned to Earth, she was met with a hero's welcome. The streets were lined with people, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. Leaders from every nation sought her out, offering her accolades, medals, and positions of power. But Martha refused them all. She didn't want fame or fortune. She just wanted to go home. Her farm was exactly as she had left it, the fields stretching out in neat rows, the crops swaying gently in the breeze. It was a simple life, but it was hers. She set to work immediately, her hands finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of tilling the soil, planting seeds, and tending to the land. The shovel, now a symbol of her victory, leaned against the side of her barn, its blade gleaming in the sunlight. But even as she returned to her routine, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that her fight was far from over. The Empire's retreat was temporary. She knew they would come back, and when they did, they would be more determined than ever to crush Earth and its people. She couldn't let that happen. In the weeks that followed, Martha began to train. She practiced with the shovel, honing her skills, refining her techniques. She studied the Empire's tactics, learning everything she could about their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. She knew she couldn't do it alone, so she reached out to others. Soldiers, scientists, engineers, anyone who could help prepare Earth for the battles to come. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Across the planet, people began to rally behind her. They saw in her a leader, someone who had stood against impossible odds and emerged victorious. They began to train, to prepare, to fortify their cities and their defenses. The spirit of defiance that Martha had ignited spread like wildfire, uniting humanity in a way it never had been before. Meanwhile, in the far reaches of the galaxy, the Empire was in turmoil. The defeat of Thor had sent shockwaves through their ranks, shaking the very foundation of their dominance. The High Council convened in an emergency session, their voices filled with anger and fear. How could this have happened? How could a single human, armed with nothing but a shovel, have defeated their greatest warrior? The answer, though they were loath to admit it, was simple. They had underestimated humanity. They had seen them as weak, primitive, unworthy of their attention. But Martha had shown them the truth. Humanity was resilient, resourceful, and, above all, unyielding. And if one human could do what she had done, what could an entire planet of them achieve? The Empire's leaders debated their next move. Some argued for a full-scale invasion, a show of force that would crush Earth once and for all. Others cautioned against it, warning that such an action could unite the galaxy against them. In the end, they decided on a more subtle approach. They would isolate Earth, cut off its allies, and weaken it from within. And when the time was right, they would strike. But Martha was ready. She knew the Empire's tactics, their strategies, their weaknesses. And she knew that as long as she drew breath, she would fight to protect her home, her family, her world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha stood in her fields, the shovel resting on her shoulder. She looked up at the stars, their light twinkling like distant promises. Somewhere out there, the Empire was plotting, preparing. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced them once and emerged victorious. And she would do it again as many times as it took. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The wind rustled through the crops, carrying with it the scent of earth and growth. It was a simple life, but it was hers, and she would fight to protect it no matter the cost. As she turned to head back to the house, she caught sight of a young girl watching her from the edge of the field. The girl held a small shovel in her hands, her eyes wide with admiration. Martha smiled and walked over to her. "You want to learn how to use that?" she asked, nodding at the shovel. The girl nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am." Martha knelt down, her eyes meeting the girl's. "Then listen closely," she said. "This isn't just a tool. It's a weapon. And with it, you can protect what matters most." The girl's eyes sparkled with determination. "I will," she said. Martha smiled and stood up, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Good, because the fight's not over yet, and we're going to need all the help we can get." As they walked back to the house together, the stars above them seemed to shine a little brighter. The galaxy was vast, and the challenges ahead were great. But as long as there were people like Martha, people who were willing to stand up and fight, there was hope. And hope, she knew, was the most powerful weapon of all.